Hello. So this is my new method of doing things, which is recording my lecture videos, and then you will take a review quiz on this video. So that's part of the learning sequence. So this is CA1, and it is about models of memory. So we're expanding on what we learned last year with memory and realizing that we cannot actually see inside the brain and see exactly what's going on with memory. We can see that we use the hippocampus and different parts of the brain in memory, but we don't know exactly what's happening. So that's why these are models or theories of what goes on in our memory. And you'll recognize these, at least one of them. So let's go through these two models. So as you know, memory is a cognitive process. It's one of those processes we look at that happen internally as we are thinking. And the two models that we're going to look at is the multi-store model, which was developed by Atkinson and Schifrin, and the working memory model. So we did not touch on the working memory model last year, but we did talk about the multi-store model, and I'll explain that more. So here's the information processing theory that we talked about. You look at how your brain processes information. So we take information in from environmental stimuli right here, and then we have overt behavior that is a response to whatever information we take in. So the cognitive psychology, this approach that we're in right now, cares about what is going on in your mind. And remember, we talk about how perception can be different because everybody's experience is different. So that is what cognitive psychology is looking at. That is what this approach in International Baccalaureate Psychology is about, cognitive. Okay, so the first model, and you'll notice on your objectives that you need to know about two different models of a cognitive process of memory. This is the first one, multi-store model. We will abbreviate it MSM often, okay? So the parts of it are that there are three types of memory. What are the three types of memory from last year? One of them is short-term. The other is sensory. This is the one that people always forget. Sensory memory is everything you see and hear in a fraction of a second, and then it's gone. Remember, the example I give is walking down the hallway. You don't remember everybody that you pass because you don't need to. So you remember where you are, and then you get rid of that because it's not useful for you. That is sensory memory. Short-term memory. How long do we remember things in short term? And how many items can we remember? 7 plus or minus 2 items for 20 seconds. That's short-term memory. And the last one is long-term. If you remember, it's unlimited capacity forever. In 1968, Atkinson and Schifrin came up with this theory of memory, and this is the foundation of memory. This is what people talk about all the time. Even people who have never taken a psych class know the difference between short-term memory and long-term memory, even if it is not an accurate definition. But this is the foundation of memory research, but it is very simple. It doesn't really talk about how memory is working as you store it or what's going on in your mind as you're thinking about what's going on in the situation. So it is empirically supported by research, however. Here is just a visual of that system, okay? And we drew these last year, so we should be familiar with that. Okay, Glanzer and Kunitz is an experiment that shows or gives evidence for the multi-store model, and it was done in 1966, okay? This is an experiment that shows the serial position effect, okay? If you remember, we did this experiment in class. I read a list of words, and then I put a graph up, and I said, who remembers this word? Raise your hand. Who remembers this word? And we did a graph, and it always shows up exactly the same. And I'll show you the graph. Okay, so it always looks like this graph here. So the position in the word list is where we were. Sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Hold on. Okay, so the position of where the word was determined whether more people would remember it or not. And if you remember, we always forget the middle and we remember the beginning and the end. Those are called primacy and recency. Now, what these two things give evidence for is the multi-store model. And the reason for that is because Primacy gives evidence for long-term memory. And that's because when you first hear a list of words, you are rehearsing it in your mind so that it goes into your long-term memory. You may ever even remember those first words the next day if I was to ask you. The recency effect gives evidence for short-term memory because as soon as I said, that's the end of the list, write down as many words as you can, you may have been rehearsing those last words that I said. So both of those give evidence for two different stores of memory and therefore the multi-store model. Now, the experiment that was done here tried to prevent recency. Now, how can we prevent short-term memory? We can give someone something called a filler task. So after I said all the words, if I did not let you write it down right away, and I said, write your name using your non-dominant hand, or tell me all the members of Winnie the Pooh, or tell me about the last movie you saw, or count by fives. That's a filler task that is going to cause you to stop rehearsing and therefore block short-term memory because we know that short-term memory cannot last longer than 20 seconds if you're not rehearsing it. So when Glanzer and Kunitz did that, they noticed that recency effect went away. They still had the long-term memory because they didn't need to rehearse to have the long-term memory. So the results support the MSM, the multi-store model, because short-term and long-term memory are separate. Info moves from short-term memory to long-term memory if rehearsed, but gradually. It decays if not, and it's gone. Please make sure you understand this experiment. This is going to be one of the options for your IA, okay? Okay. And the reason that we're going through this is because it gives evidence for the multi-store model. So if you were asked about that on one of your papers, this is one of those experiments that you want to remember so you can say, this is why we know it's true. We're not just taking it as a blanketed statement of being true. It's true because we have research to give evidence for it. Okay, moving on. Think about what some strengths and criticisms are for the multi-store model. What's good about it? What's bad about it? Here are some strengths and criticisms. So evidence of a separate short-term and long-term memory is supported, but it's really simple. It fails to account for all the complexity of memory. Many of the studies also lack ecological validity. How often are you asked in real life to remember a list of words? Not very often unless you're in psychology class. Okay. Badley, Thompson, and Buchanan is a study that was done in 1975, and this showed that the capacity of short-term memory is greater for shorter words than longer words. So if you can remember 7 plus or minus 2 items in your short-term memory, that should be the same whether it's a super long word, like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, or a super short word, like bat. But this experiment showed that short-term memory capacity, you can remember more items, like if they were bat, cat, dog, than longer words. This phenomenon cannot be explained by the multi-store model because the multi-store model says 7 plus or minus items for 20 seconds. Okay, so do you notice how this is a criticism of the multi-store model in that not that it's not a true model, but that it may not be complete. Here is the second model, and this is the working memory model, okay? Now, this is gonna show you a graphic of how it works. And basically, what it's doing is if we remember what working memory is another name for short-term memory. So basically, it's zooming in on that short-term memory store in the multi-store model to say what's going on in short-term memory. What is going on in someone's brain when they're remembering things short-term, because we know short-term becomes long-term. And for me, it reminds me of the movie Inside Out. So if you've seen Inside Out, that is, all about the little emotions that live in your mind. So this isn't really tied to emotion, but it's saying that there are different parts working in your brain for working memory. And let's go through what those are right now. So the main difference is that there's more than one short-term memory, okay? And again, we're zooming in on that store of the multi-store model. The central executive is one part, kind of if you imagine like this working memory system, there are little parts in your brain. And the central executive is like the one who's directing the attention. This is the controlling system that monitors other components called slave systems. Probably not the best choice of names or wording, but that was what they were called. So please, I did not make that up. These slave systems, we're going to go into what those are. But the most important job of the central executive is attention control. So you have an automatic level. That's what's doing things that you don't have to consciously think about. So when you're writing down notes, you don't have to think about how to write the letter A. That is the automatic level. And then you have, or biking to class. Then you have the supervisory attention level. So this is when something new comes your way. Like let's say you've never handled writing like Japanese words, and you would have to give specific control to that or attention to that you wouldn't have to give just writing regular letters of the alphabet that you do all the time. Okay. But the central executive is the one who is directing your attention. So if you think about it, there's this little executive in your brain who's saying, you should check TikTok right now. You should check Snapchat, or you should pay attention to Miss Santos. Okay. So that's a central executive. So if a car was coming at you when you were biking to class, you would have to pay attention because it's an emergency. All right. Episodic buffer is one of those slave systems, one of the other systems in the working memory model. And this is where information appears when you recall it, like a television screen in your mind. So if you were to think about what you did yesterday, or the last time you hung out with your friends, or your last birthday, those would come up kind of like they do in Inside Out when they think about memories, okay? So you see in your mind the memory of your last birthday. Phonological loop. Phonological loop is that voice inside your mind, okay? So there's two components of this. One is the articulatory control system, and that holds information in verbal form. So let's say you saw someone's name, you might pronounce it in your mind, you might hear it. So maybe you see someone and you see their name, like visually, or you might hear their name as to how you pronounce it, okay? Rehearsing a phone number would use this part, like if you were saying it over and over and over again. And then there's a phonological store. This phonological store receives information from sensory, long-term, or articulatory controlled. And this is called your inner ear. And that's where you store these different things. So that is the phonological loop. It's the hearing part of of the working memory model. And there is the visual spatial sketchpad. So let's say you were looking at your room and you may be trying to figure out like where you're going to move your furniture or where you want to paint your room or whatever you want to do there. Okay, that would be the visual spatial sketchpad. It deals with visual and spatial information from sensory or long-term memory, your inner eye. So you're thinking about like, I saw this in somebody else's room, whatever. So here is the working model memory, a picture of all those different components. So you see the central executive would be dictating what all the other parts do. And those things are also attached to long-term memory. So things move back and forth from these little components that are in your brain, controlling your attention and your thinking process. That is attached to memory, right? Because when you're thinking, you're using memory as well as taking information in that you're going to remember later. So it moves both ways. This model is based on two premises. First, if two tasks make use of the same component, they cannot be performed successfully together. So if the phonological loop is if you try to say two things at the same time in your mind, you probably can't do that, right? But if two tasks make use of different components, it should be possible to perform them together, which is multitasking. So if you were to picture a hippopotamus and hear the word lavender, you can probably do those at the same time because they're using two different components of the working model memory. Here's some strengths and criticisms. What do you think are strengths and criticisms of the working memory model? We are abbreviating that WMM. So first of all, it's a dynamic model. This is a good thing rather than static. There's a separation between the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. That's supported by evidence of the experiment I just kind of gave you to think about in your mind. We cannot explain spatial awareness of blind people. So blind people will still have spatial awareness. They'll be able to walk around their home. They may be able to get around like school and stuff that they've been to a lot. There's also a vagueness of an explanation of how the central executive or the episodic buffer work. Like, what really is that? Badley, Thompson, and Buchanan found that word length effect that we talked about earlier, the difference in the length of the word and how that affects how many items you can remember in short-term memory. They found that explained because articulation patterns of longer words are also longer. So if I was to time you, it takes you longer to say hippopotamus than to say bat. In a given amount of time, you can pronounce less longer words than shorter words. So experiments used articulatory suppression to block the inner voice. Word length effect disappears. So if there's a visual representation, it doesn't matter how long the words are. So if I showed you the word, doesn't matter how long they are, if I block your ability to say it out loud. So that gives evidence for the fact that there are these different components in the working memory model. Comparison of the models. The working memory model provides a better explanation of storage and processing, what's going on in your mind. It includes active storage and processing, which helps in understanding cognitive tasks, such as reading comprehension, mental arithmetic. And it helps explain why people can perform different cognitive tasks at the same time, that multitasking is possible, but not if you're using the same component, which is really interesting. That is it for the memories of model. Sorry if this one was the models of memory. Sorry if this one was a little long. That was CA1.